Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of our top stories about the fallout from the debate. Overall, there's been talk from one side, the other side, of course. Everybody's trying to cast their message, everybody's trying to get their word in. And of course, we will end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So I obviously already asked who you thought won the debate in one of our previous episodes. Let me ask you this. Which issue do you think deserved the most time or deserved the time that it got on that stage? Whether it be immigration, whether it be the economy, whether it be foreign policy, whether it be abortion. All of these different issues got plenty of time, but which one actually deserved to be front and center throughout the course of the night? So, let's jump to our first article that comes from Politico. Trump sells himself as a leader on IVF, angering some Republicans. And this one is always fascinating because, remember, Donald Trump is not the average Republican. He is not the, oh, let me go on the principled values of pro-life. And if you're going on a very principled stance pro-life wise, and IVF has a whole bunch of extra understand here, this is the framing of pro-life people. If IVF is done where there are extra eggs that have been fertilized, those are extra people that are being stored in a freezer, and sometimes they're not always used in the IVF process. So pro-life activists, they say, hey, at the end of the day, you are throwing away a life. You're not using a life, or you're haplessly throwing them into a womb knowing that some of them have a very small percentage of surviving. That is a very difficult position to hold as a Republican nowadays, where a lot of different families use IVF. And even if families don't use IVF, a lot of people want the option to use IVF in order to have children. Now, there are ethical ways of doing it. We only have one egg and one fertilized egg implanted at a time. You do it very slowly. They're not all kept fertilized. They're kept separate until the point where you actually artificially inseminate the egg with sperm, and then from that point forward you use that one egg, and then you don't necessarily have to worry about throwing away those extra lives. But that's extremely expensive. It's not as necessarily as efficient as putting in, and I say efficient because the more eggs you put in any given time that you're doing an IVF treatment, the more likely that at least one of them will stick. And at the end of the day, the pro-life argument is not okay with that because, like I said, you are haplessly throwing extra living beings, because at the point of contraception, that is a human being, it has its own unique DNA in the eyes of pro-life people, then you're actually throwing those lives away because you're trying to play a statistical game. It's kind of like having a utilitarian view on a large scale, which is, oh, we have to sacrifice some of these people for the good of the many. So you can see where the people who do not support IVF are coming from, and you can see why when Trump comes up and he casts himself as the IVF king, how he's going to be all supportive of it. This is actually something that is going to get underneath the skin of pro-life activists, but not even just pro-life activists, especially a certain segment of the Republican Party, the evangelicals. Even though not all of evangelicals are actually Republican, there is a good swath of the Republican Party now that is evangelicals that have very pro-life stances, and even some of the old-timey pro-life Republicans. So this is the divide that you get with a practical president who, to some degree, did do a little bit of pro-life stuff. I mean, he overturned Roe v. Wade, but was that actually purely based on the pro-life part of it? No, it was based on the fact that this has been a talking point for a long time. It has pro-life implications, but it doesn't necessarily reset it so that there's no abortion. So it wasn't an ultimist or a maximist win for the pro-life movement. It was a stepping stone, and it was something that he felt that he could actually get out of the way, especially as he had the opportunity to put 3 justices on the court. So you have the president who has done the most for the pro-life movement, and yet doesn't necessarily want to come down hard on the pro-life side because it is not practical, it's not pragmatic for him. And you can see why this is extremely frustrating. So let's get into some of the quotes from the article here so we can dive a little bit deeper. Quote, Donald Trump pitched himself as a leader on in vitro fertilization during his Tuesday debate with Vice President Kamala Harris. His plans are angering swaths of the Republican Party. I didn't even realize they used the word swaths in here. Wow, look at that. I parodied the language of the article without even knowing it. Quote, the former president, eager to deflect attacks that his election would threaten fertility care, has gone so far as to pledge free IVF treatments to all Americans, paid for either by insurance companies or the federal government, end quote. So this is another part that is more than likely to actually frustrate pro-life activists, because at the end of the day, pro-life activists are going to say, you as a individual are able to make your decisions, but they're not moral decisions, so we should try to restrict them. And there are obviously different flavors of people who are supporting the pro-life movement. So I can't speak for every single person. Some people are going to say, no, you don't actually have the right to end somebody else's life or affect the outcome of somebody else's life by possibly having multiple eggs that have been fertilized, so basically 3 different human beings, so on and so forth. We've been through this section of the argument, but where a lot of people who aren't necessarily super strong on pro-life may still have an issue is actually using tax dollars, using my tax dollars, your tax dollars. If you're very pro-life, but you're maybe a little bit more libertine in the social aspects, and you say, I would never do it, I wouldn't want my family members to ever do it, but it doesn't mean that the option shouldn't be there. Now, when your tax dollars are directly going to it, it's basically like you're sponsoring it, and that can raise some very serious moral questions for people. And also the question becomes that Politico points out later on, so if it is actually going to be mandated, does that mean that religious organizations that do not support IVF or abortion on principle alone are going to actually be forced, like religious insurance agencies, would they be forced to carry coverage for this? These are very serious issues, and it moves beyond, because normally there would be a argument to let everyone be their own. And I think even Donald Trump would fall into that category. He would fall into the libertine category where it's, hey, get government out of your life. We don't necessarily want them involved in these sort of decisions. And I think that's where he falls on a pragmatic level. I think that is what the argument he would make, and that's probably even where he would come down for the most part on his pro-life stances. I think you could make that argument from a Trumpian perspective, so to speak. And what I mean by that is the new perspective of the Republican Party, which is pragmatic, but also resonates to some degree with the Reagan era of smaller government. But this is actually antithetical to that. If you're forcing healthcare providers, if you're forcing even the federal government to cover these sort of things, you are directly telling businesses within the United States what they can and cannot carry. And of course, that is not a big deal to some people. Some people understand that, they believe that is the perfectly normal purview of the government, but that is not the small government, less involvement in your life perspective of the Republican Party. And let's be clear, the Republican Party has begun to change. There's a populist wing that is more willing to do direct intervention in order to help the American people, whether it be extra stimulus or tariff policies and more protectionist economic policies in order to bring jobs back to the United States. I'm not denying that. But the traditional Republicans, they're not loving that. They're saying this is not the libertine attitude that I grew up with. This is not actually an argument for small government. This is a argument for bigger, more overreaching, more oversight within government in order to control what is or isn't happening. So that is a big issue for many people that would be of the normal Republican Party as of 10, 15 years ago. And obviously, we live in a different age. We understand that the Trump coalition is very different than just traditional Republicans. But at the end of the day, he does indeed need these people in order to win. He needs the classic Republicans in order to win. He can't have them defect to the Libertarians. Now that RFK is out of the way, he can't have them go over to RFK, so that doesn't necessarily matter anymore. But he cannot have them defect and go over to the liberals either. So he has to at least keep them entertained, and these sort of questions always arise when you hear, and that I think honestly is why the media covers it so much when he flip-flops on the pro-life stuff because, one, it's actually beneficial. So if we'll move beyond just the media, but if you're a Democratic operative and he is flip-flopping on IVF and the pro-choice, pro-life argument, one, it's beneficial to show your people that, okay, he doesn't feel comfortable on this argument. He knows that we have the popular opinion on this argument. That's why he's flip-flopping so much. You can make a really strong narrative out of that. But also, then you know that actually it sows a little bit of discord within the ranks of his own side by continually showing these sort of things and putting that message out there. And that's what a lot of Democratic operatives have been doing. Trust me, I've seen the videos, I've heard the podcasts, and some people aren't actually Democratic operatives. They just imbibe the messaging from the actual operatives. But some operatives are out there saying, oh yeah, you have flip-floppy Trump. I don't necessarily trust him on any of his stances on abortion versus pro-life. And at the end of the day, he's not actually satisfying the people that he should be satisfying. He's not taking a principled stance. And I think the stance that he's taking is wrong anyway, morally. And they're just trying to throw it out there. And they say it very casually because they're good at crafting a narrative. But if you actually really break it down, you're saying, oh, okay, that's actually very clever on their part in order to divide the side that is supposed to support him while also showing their own people that this is a weak spot for him that we have to continue to press. So let's go into that section where I was talking about the issues about possibly forcing insurance agencies to actually comply. Quote, Trump's campaign is defending the universal IVF policy as a necessary long-term investment given the country's record low birth rate, which is honestly a relatively you can make a relatively conservative argument, at least in the ideas of the modern conservative party, where pro-family policy is something that is most definitely advocated for by lots of modern conservatives, and the birth rate is something that most definitely, I don't want to say scares, but sits in the back of the mind of many modern conservatives. So you can see that spin there. That's also a relatively populist spin or a relatively new age conservative spin. It's something that, you would catch your J.D. Vance's or maybe your Roth's Douthat's saying, which is we need to spend more money in order to correct some of these issues that we think are extremely important in the United States. These are issues that are leading to the degradation of family values, to the destruction of the Western nuclear family, and we need to invest money in order to solve some of these problems. It's actually very interesting when you look across the world. Many programs, even the ones that are done in like authoritarian states like China, a lot of just throwing money at the problem does not actually solve the birth rate issue. You have to have very specific incentives in place, and even then, it doesn't always work out perfectly. Or you have to have an entire culture, like in Mongolia, where they restructure how they go about viewing family. And maybe it's a more maternal focused society. That's how they went about it in Mongolia. And then there are other countries that have done like tax incentives. When you finally have your, I believe it's third kid in Hungary, if I'm not crazy, I believe it's your third kid, then from that point forward, the adult woman no longer has to pay any taxes. I could be wrong. It's either Hungary or Turkey, and I believe it is the third child. But my point being that there have been plenty of pro-natalist policies that haven't necessarily worked out. And I think it's hilarious that Trump's campaign is trying to frame it this way as a pro-natalist policy in order to get some of the conservatives behind them. But then the question becomes, is it a pro-natalist policy more important or the pro-life movement? I think the pro-natalist policy has probably been with the Republican Party for maybe 8 years versus the pro-life movement that has been with the party for 40 years. So if you're asking people on a pragmatic level to decide which one they're going to find more important, it's probably the one that's been defining the Republican Party for longer. But I think that's just hilarious on their part. Quote, and aides credit the policy for an increase in support from independents in some battleground states while arguing it has not caused a decline in support from anti-abortion voters. And I think that they probably are not wrong. While I think his flip-flopping is not necessarily beneficial, and I think the most ardent of pro-life people will not be supporting him anyway, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to make the largest hole in the coalition. But it does provide Kamala Harris with an opening. Not only, and let's be clear, her pro-life policies are never going to be as even close to Donald Trump, or even if you want to, the people that are very pro-life, that are no exceptions, so on and so forth, they would argue that Donald Trump is pro-choice. But he is way less pro-choice than Kamala Harris is, so you're probably not going to be able to peel him away on that basis. But maybe on IVF, maybe there is space for Kamala Harris to come in and take some of those independent voters. If they really are up for grabs, like Trump says, then who are you going to trust to actually have more how should I say? More pro-woman choice, what they do with their body arguments. That's probably the best way without making it sound overly cringy, even though it already sounds pretty cringy. Those are probably those people are probably looking at Kamala Harris and saying, okay, she's already pro-choice. She's more than likely to actually aid with these sort of issues that we're having in actually funding some IVF programs rather than the person that overturned Roe. So this is a place where she could very well come in and capture on this, I don't want to say weakness, because Trump's trying to say it's not a weakness, but politically, it's not 100%. And if something is not 100%, if it's not working 100% for you, that means some percentage of it is working against you. I know. Wow. Look at that. Pretty straightforward, Alex. But it's just true. And when it comes down to the independents, can he necessarily lose any? I don't think he can. It's going to be an independent election. We know that. Everybody else is basically calcified. The people that were going to vote for Biden are going to continue to vote for Kamala. Some people have flooded to her side since Biden has dropped out, and we're basically at a draw again. That is where the polls are with margin of error. That's what we're looking at. So we've talked about some of Trump's policies. We've talked about his coming out of this debate, trying to cast himself as an IVF king, basically. Who the short king moment is gone. No, the IVF king has now arisen through American politics. It's going to be a funny moment for sure. But the one I want to talk about on her part was Kamala Harris accepting Trump's racist lie that immigration is bad. So we talked about where the issue from his own side for Trump is going to come. IVF, probably. Now let's talk about where the issue from Kamala's own side might very well come from. And this one was interesting. It's from The Intercept. I already read you the headline, but they're making an argument that, and I've heard this argument multiple times from some liberal commentators, that Kamala Harris, as well as Joe Biden, have conceded too much on the immigration issue. And it's not necessarily that they've conceded in saying, oh, well, hold on, it's actually an issue. We're going to go out there and just verbally do something. It's no, that they've actually started to legitimize, if you want to use that word. It feels kind of odd saying it, but they have made the complaints and arguments legitimate of the Republican Party and Donald Trump by basically tacking to the right on immigration. And The Intercept is not happy with it whatsoever. It wants to go through multiple layers of this argument, whether it be having enough people to work in our economy, whether it be people more on a moral level, that we have a moral obligation to let people into our country in order to ensure that they are able to have a good life. They're attacking this on all different levels and saying that Kamala Harris is not doing the right thing here, and it is pissing some people on the left off. And I think The Intercept lives in a world, just like the pro-lifers live in a world of ideological purism, which is, sure, on an ideological pure plane, you can advocate for pro-life stuff all the time. It is not as popular as you think it is. And you can advocate for no borders or almost unlimited immigration except for people who are like terrorist threats, so on and so forth. All you want in an ideologically pure world when you're sitting with your buddies at your magazine or at your think tank or whatever. But on a practical level, people do not think that way. Even if they do think that way to some degree, if they hold that as a core tenet and a value, they are still affected by the outside messaging going on in the world around them. So I think this is, once again, they're both examples of people on the same side of the aisle, but further down on either issue, continually pulling at the candidates in order to get them to come along to the edge of the party. And I do not necessarily think that it is actually going to be beneficial for them. But let's hear out The Intercept on some of their arguments here. Quote, Vice President Kamala Harris, for her part, didn't bother to counter the sentiment, which is basically Trump's border policy, immigration, his issues with immigration, and his rants about it throughout the debate. Quote, the central ideological violence at the heart of Trump's message. Harris, albeit in the predictably moderate tones of a Democratic border authoritarian, upheld the right-wing lie that immigration, the migration of poor people, that is, should be stopped. Now, I think that if you're going to go and slice into the issue, you can make plenty of good arguments about having people come to the country, whether it be because they already have family members here. So you're actually increasing the amount of people who have a buy-in if they're already natural U.S. citizens. So say your mother. No, we'll do it inverse. Say the son of a family has come to the United States. They've become a United States citizen. It makes sense that you would bring in, or at least there could be a very good argument made that this person has gone through the naturalization process. We should allow their family to come in here because obviously he is invested in America to some degree. That's a natural way to grow our population, to possibly grow the GDP, and also while satisfying some arguments that we can't just let random people in here that won't assimilate, but we want to bring in people who actually assimilate into the American culture, understand our history, understand our values, so on and so forth. So if you want to have a pro-immigration policy that still has some of those more conservative leanings, and that can probably satisfy both sides, you can make a good argument for that. But I don't think you can make a good argument for, like The Intercept would, which is we should just have, at the end of the day, not unlimited immigration. They do not say that throughout here, but they don't propose any limits. So I'm not saying they're saying it has to be unlimited, but they also don't say there is a natural cutoff where at the end of that point, so say that we have a cap on migration and I heard this argument from somebody that was talking the other day. I had watched a video and watched them in person, and I thought it was actually a very good point. Say that the immigration number that we're going to allow, so we're going to allow a certain amount of immigrants in throughout the course of a year, is 1,000. And this is just a nice round number. It's not realistic. 1,000 people could come through the border in one day. But the point being, it's 1,000 people. What are you willing to do as a nation to the 1,001st? And a lot of people would say we're willing to basically shut them out, jail them, send them away. Some people would say that, well, maybe we hold them in a process and we ask if they need asylum. We give them what we can, but we send them away. And The Intercept basically proposes in here and offers the moral argument that it is not right to turn those people away. So they basically are asking for unlimited immigration. If they're not willing, if they're saying morally we have the responsibility morally to let these people, or at least examine their claims and try to let them into the United States, and we're not actually going to enforce our own border policy. So say up to 1,000, we're willing to take some of these people on, we're willing to take on their asylum claims, but at 1,001, we're basically saying, oh, nope, you know what? We're not actually going to enforce this hard limit that we have. We're just going to continue to do the same thing. You're basically for just unlimited immigration. Because if you're not willing to impose the limit or impose a punishment on that limit or a restriction to make sure that you stay underneath that limit that you had proposed earlier, then basically you're saying it's okay to just continue on and just do the same thing and allow more and more people to come into the country, which I thought was an interesting argument when I heard it. So The Intercept here is basically calling on Kamala Harris to say, no. We need you to be a leader on the pro-immigration, the pro-migration side of the ballot. And she's not willing to fold. And I think this is actually going to be a winner for her. Just like Donald Trump going and trying to win the independents by trying to really soften on IVF and say that, hey, I'm an IVF king. Kamala Harris is coming over here and saying, I am the border queen. I have prosecuted international drug smuggling operations. I have gone after some of these cartels that are operating within the United States, and I am a hard butt on these sort of issues, and I will make sure that our communities are safe, our United States is safe, and that people are not just randomly migrating across the board, so on and so forth. She is definitely tacked to the middle on this one in order to bring back not only just independents, but even some people from within her own party. Just like there's a contingent of people who are Republican but are okay with IVF because there's pro-natalist implications, there are also people on the left that are genuinely concerned now that some of the immigration issues have hit their cities specifically. They were insulated before, and now it's hit specifically, and their tax dollars are going to it on a local scale. Even people within our own party are willing to change on the issue of immigration. But The Intercept, they're not having it. They're not having it whatsoever. So let's go into this next section. Quote, actually, I'll read a little bit of a quote from the debate itself, and it gives a little bit more context, and then we'll go into their commentary. Quote, why did the administration wait until 6 months after the election to act? He asked Harris. And, quote, would you have done anything differently from President Biden on this? So basically, what they're going to, actually, I will continue to read their commentary. It's a little bit out of sorts. I'll provide the context afterwards. Quote, the narrative of a border crisis was taken for granted from the jump, specifically that it is a crisis for the U.S., not the desperate people who have fled their homes and must face brutal, unforgiving barriers to seek refuge here. Harris answered Muir accordingly, treating migration as a problem of criminality to be policed and fought. So basically, inherent in Muir's question when he was talking to Kamala Harris was the fact that this is a critical issue that I want you to address while you're here on the stage, that the American people want you to address while you're on this stage. And The Intercept is saying, well, it's not actually as much of a crisis as it is for the people coming to this country. And while you may be correct that the people that are coming to this country are having a hard time, they have to deal with a lot, and that we are a wealthy nation and we can absorb some changes more easily to our lives than they could to theirs, that does not mean that they have even a moral right. Now, I'm not even saying a legal right, a moral right to enter into our country without coming through the proper ports of entry. Okay? If you believe in an international system where the national sovereignty of nations is less important than the human lives on an individual level, then of course this framing makes sense to you on a moral level. If you believe that national sovereignty is actually important to the division of private property, and that private property allows for the prospering of human society and for a moral system of interaction between parties, then you can make a very strong moral argument for, how should I say? You can make a very strong moral argument that just allowing people to come into our country is not actually a good thing. It is not moral to haplessly import people and give away the resources of this country in order to support them. You could make a moral argument on that front. So I would say that their framing here, I don't want to say it falls apart because obviously we have different worldviews. And I think it's a very interesting conversation to have. And if you're a person of God, you would say, well, you could make both arguments saying that actually all human life is valuable, devoid of whether or not you live within our national borders. And you could also make an argument about the fact that, yes, that is very well true, but on a practical level, even though God sees everybody the same, on a practical level, we have these divides and different systems of government to protect the individuals that are within and allow the prospering of God's religion, so on and so forth. So, and the reason I go to God is because that is one where I've examined it very closely more recently, because God does ask us to look at every single person as equal. And that is the very strong moral basis for arguing that people should be allowed to come into this country. They are not lesser than because they are from a different place. And that is fair enough. You just have to make a practical argument rather than necessarily, you're not necessarily saying that they are lesser than because they're from another place. You're saying that in order to ensure that we are able to thrive, handle the incoming population, as well as ensure the protection of our own population, that you have to actually restrict people coming from another place. That doesn't mean you demean them. That doesn't mean you pretend that they are lesser because they are from a different place, but simply for the need to protect your own nation, your own sovereignty. That is the argument that you would have to make. But that is why, like I said, the reason I took the framing of a Christian is because I have genuinely pondered on that argument more recently. And while I don't necessarily think that my position has changed too much, it does throw an interesting moral wrinkle in there. And I can't dismiss The Intercept outright, just as, oh, crazy hooks who think that everybody has the right to cross every single national border, because obviously I don't have that framing. I don't think it's necessarily important to continually import people from another country. But there is still a underlying moral argument that is justifiable, and you have to understand where people are coming from in order to actually have conversations with them and engage in civic discussion. And I think that's exactly what should happen around this argument here. And I think that having the framing that it is a Christian issue actually allows you to kind of delve deep into some of these more Republican circles or more Christian circles nowadays that tend to lean a little bit more right than left, and have this conversation in a genuine way. Because at the end of the day, this is something that has been on the minds of people for 8, 12 years, even underneath the Obama administration. And Trump obviously brought it back to the forefront. But this is something Kamala Harris is going to have to deal with. She is tacking to the middle in order to actually win people over on immigration. And the people on the left side of her party that are not on the same page are yelling and screaming, saying, no, 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 come to us. Why are you going to the middle? No, come to us. We are in the moral right. We are in the ethical right. And honestly, some even argue that they are in the economic right. So, with that said, we've covered 2 separate articles about each candidate, and we've talked about how one side of the party is trying to pull them one way or the other. Normally, we do 3 articles. Today, I wanted to cover 2 of them because I think both articles actually exemplify the argument from a more passionate, ideologically consistent side of the party, and both candidates are playing the political game, and they're trying to win over the moderates, and they're trying to be pragmatic. And it is always interesting to break these things down, especially when we see how they handle these issues on a debate stage. So, with that said, let's jump into our final story, which is our daily delight. Golden Retriever with bellyache FaceTimes grandma for comfort, and it's too cute. And if you have not seen a dog FaceTime somebody and get extremely excited, then you won't necessarily know the joy that is inherent even in the words of that headline. But I have seen it before, and this guy, he loves his grandma. He's not feeling too good, but then grandma comes on. He's like, oh, you know what? Today's not gonna be half bad. And we do love to see it. We love to see our pets happy. We love to see them interacting with people in a positive way. And even when it's over FaceTime, not only can this grandmother spread joy, but this dog can spread joy as well. So if you want to check out this video, or you want to check out the 2 articles from today, you can go into the link in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. So with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.